Good morning, everyone. Let me just briefly introduce what we're going to do today and tell you how this came about. First of all, our two panelists really need no introduction, especially here.
They already hate you, Jeff. I'm
what?
watching the Bang Post. They already hate you.
Really? They hate me already? So this is what happened already on stage when Jamie was talking. Mitch says, I hope they love me, and Ta-Nehisi says, I hope they hate me, which is like the classic public intellectual politician split, you know. Actually, we have no pulse right now. We're actually all dead. Yeah, we're just dead. By the way, these cards also, if you put your thumb on them, they'll measure how racist you are. And that data will be fed to Microsoft and the NSA. So you might want to not participate.
It's moving.
Ta-Nehisi hates technology. He's like Amish. He can't stand any technology.
I'm not going to look at it.
Don't look. Okay. So this is the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, who all of you know here, and who is, let's give him a round of applause. He is one of America's leading mayors. Obviously, much of his work these past months and years has been to rebuild his city after Katrina. It's coming up on the 10th anniversary in August. And so we're very glad to have you here. Ta-Nehisi Coates is my friend and colleague from The Atlantic. Weren't you voted like the most important intellectual or something by some website? No, I think there was some website. Anyway, he's a very, very important intellectual.
Thank you.
And
voted by you.
What?
Voted by you.
Yeah, I voted it. Oh, the line just dropped through the floor, by the way. All right, we're going to stop joking around because this is serious, or at least for 2 minutes we're going to not joke around. Okay. The Ta-Nehisi, of course, national correspondent of The Atlantic. Many of you, the whole country is familiar with one of his most recent pieces, The Case for Reparations. So how this came about is kind of interesting. I've been talking to Mitch. I'm going to call you Mitch, even though you have an official title. It's all right. I've been talking to Mitch for several months now for a project I'm working on at The Atlantic about crime in cities. And I would sometimes come back from New Orleans and I would mention to Ta-Nehisi something, and he would have some comment about it, and I would go back to Mitch, and then Mitch would say something to Ta-Nehisi, and I thought, you know, I don't need to be like the Middle East peace negotiator here. I can just have them come directly to Aspen. Through the miracle of Aspen, we can get them on the same stage to have this conversation. The conversation is about some very, very hot button, sensitive issues. The statistic that appalls me and horrifies me and makes me interested in the work that Mitch is doing, and we're going to turn to you in a second to give a brief overview of the work. The statistic that doesn't leave my head is the following. Since 1980, 315,000 African Americans have been murdered in the United States. And you could place that number in context, if you will, in a minute. In New Orleans, I think the number is roughly 7,000. African-American males have been murdered. The vast majority of those murders are committed by other African-American males. The jails are filled with African-Americans who are in jail for felonies. And so the question that the mayor has grappled with, and it's interesting that he's done this in a city that has so many other challenges at the moment, including rebuilding from a devastation. The challenge that the mayor has taken on is to figure out a way to end this problem, to end this devastation in certain poor African-American communities. So I want to just start, if you can give us a couple of minutes of overview of A, what you're doing, and B, and more important for the purpose of this discussion, why you're doing it, and tell us about the nature of the problem in your analysis of the problem, and then we'll just jump right in.
All right, Jeff, thank you, and it's great to finally meet you. And to Walter and to the whole Aspen family and to Kitty, thank you for programming the issue of violence into the Aspen DNA, because it's really important. So let me just see if I can frame this very broadly, 40,000, 30,000, and then I'll get down to the ground, and I'll try to do it in about 3 or 4 minutes. The big frame is that the United States of America is heading in the right direction, that we're actually a safer country than we have been, that racially we're better than we were 50 years ago. But as well as the country is doing, we are leaving a lot of people behind, and we can't be as good as what we want to be or what we aspire to be or what we profess to be if everybody doesn't come with us. And that forces us to have very difficult conversations that include things that always involve race, which are really hard for us because we don't know how to do it well. And so I say you can't go around it, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you got to go through it. And we're having that conversation voluntarily and involuntarily in the country. And in that context comes the destruction of New Orleans. Thank you all so much for helping us stand back up. The city is doing spectacularly well. We have turned ourselves around. We've reconstructed our education system, our healthcare system, all of that stuff that we had to do, we're doing, and you'd be amazed at really what position the city's in right now. And Jeff is right, as the mayor, I'm doing all of those things. But what happens to me is that every day, I don't have my phone with me, but I get a text from my police chief, and it's pretty much the same thing every day. And I make him do it. Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry to advise you that last night at about 2 o'clock in the morning, shots rang out in Lower 9 in the 7th Ward in Gertown, Central City. We arrived at the scene. We found a young African-American male laying face down on the ground, head blown out. He was dead on arrival, over and over and over again. So in the context of what my father told me on the day of my inauguration, he once was the mayor, and I was looking for great advice, and I said, can you tell me how to be the mayor? He said, you own every pothole now. And in that regard, what he was trying to tell me is that I'm responsible for everything in the city. And so as this continued to happen day after day after day after day, I continued to tell my team, something's wrong. What is going on? And then I started to look into this issue. And what I found was startling to me, and it will startle you. But suffice it to say that I made the decision that the city of New Orleans can never be a great place if everybody in this city doesn't come along with us. And who are the ones who are being hurt the most? Who are the ones who are most marginalized? Who are the ones that need the most help? And if lives are important, and if Black Lives Matter, and by the way, this is way before that slogan came about, we really ought to be thinking about how many kids are getting killed on the streets of New Orleans pretty much every day. So because I'm kind of defensive about my city, and I know that we don't live in isolation and we're part of this great United States of America, I kind of started looking around and seeing whether this was just because I was a bad mayor. I mean, are you a bad guy? You can't protect the streets of the city? Why is this happening? Why can't you stop it? I needed to know what it was, what the cause of it was. And this was really about saving a person's life. It's really simple. Saving a person's life. Where do you fight crime? You fight crime where it is. Where do you save people? You save people wherever they are. So you go to where the problem is, then you have to identify it. So I did. And I looked around, and what I found out was since 1980 in the United States of America, 630,000 American citizens have been killed on the streets of America, 630,000. I didn't really have any context for that, so I didn't know whether that was, it sounded like a lot to me, right? It sounded like that's not a place where I really wanted to live. And I started thinking about it because we have the World War II Museum in New Orleans that commemorates the greatest generation. Come to find out that 630,000 since 1980 is more American citizens than were killed in all of the wars of the 20th century. Let me say that again. All of the American citizens killed in all of the wars of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, all of it. That's when I said, you know what, we got a problem. And there is a culture of violence that permeates in certain segments of the United States of America. And by the way, it is white and it is black. But what I was concerned about were the people that I was responsible for, and people were getting killed in my city. And this is what those numbers look like. About somewhere between 150 to 200 a year, 8 times the national average. 95% of the victims of crime in my city are young African-American men. They're between 16 and 25, and 88% of them know each other. That's my reality as the mayor of the city, and I want to find an answer to that, which led me into this discussion. And the first disagreement that he and I had when we never talked is I have used the phrase a culture of violence that evidently tweaks people's brains and says it's really not a culture, and oh, black people are not as bad as white people, and as many white people get killed, and got into this whole discussion about race and how we see each other. And I used the term because I used it in a specific way, and that is a pattern of behavior that developed over time that has produced a certain result over and over again so that it became a normative action for some people. Because in my city, when I talk to my young men, who I speak with on a frequent basis, they say, hey man, Mayor, it's kill or be killed. I have a gun because if I don't have one, somebody's going to shoot me. I have to protect myself. It's very rational to want to shoot somebody if you feel threatened. And so we have been trying to investigate what this is, how it works, what it really means. and how we get into finding a way to move the city from a city of violence into a city of peace. And by the way, it's only in 4 or 5 neighborhoods in the city. So here's my problem. You want to come to my city, don't you? Because the city's wonderful. It's a spectacular place. We've got the Essence Festival, the Jazz Festival, and you want to ask me, is your city safe? Somebody asked me that, is your city safe?
Is your city safe?
Yeah, it depends. If you are a tourist coming into town, if you're a middle-class African-American or a middle-class white, and you're coming to my city and you want to come enjoy it, you're as safe in my city as you are any place else in the world. But if you're a young African-American man and you have a problem getting a job and you've had some interaction with the criminal justice system and you live in one of 4 neighborhoods, you're an endangered species. And by the way, this is an epidemic. All over America, in every city, in 5, 6, 7 neighborhoods, you get into an issue where you have a huge problem. And that is the essential problem that I'm trying to address, trying to solve, and trying to have a thoughtful discussion about it, because if I'm not speaking about it in the right way and I'm not engaging people in the right way, then something's wrong, because this is a problem that has to be solved, and it can be solved.
So Ta-Nehisi, I know a couple of your allergies, knowing you pretty well. Hazelnuts and the term black on black crime.
Brazil nuts.
Brazil nuts, Brazil nuts, Brazil nuts. What do you have against Brazil? Right. When I first mentioned one of these conversations to you that I was having with the mayor, and we were talking about the culture of violence in these communities, you reacted by talking about some of the work that you did on the reparations piece, which is long-term segregation, housing discrimination, education discrimination. And your argument, and you've made this argument in other pieces, is that to talk about culture is to kind of avoid talking about all the sort of structured racism that we've had over the past 400 years in this country that have led to certain conditions. So just talk about that a little bit and react to what the mayor is talking about in terms of the importance of culture, or the lack of importance of culture.
Well, I'll try to unspool this for you guys if I can. I am first and foremost a product of Baltimore, Maryland, my family in Baltimore, Maryland, and very much Baltimore City Public Schools. And I'll tell you guys a story that I tell all the time. I can remember being I guess I would have been about 11 years old, and going off to middle school. And this was the point where it dawned on me that I lived in a very, very different world. Every morning when I got up and got dressed to go to middle school and I got my stuff together, there was an entire ritual that I had to take myself through. That ritual generally concerned how I was dressed. It concerned how I was going to wear my backpack. Was I going to strap it over one shoulder or 2 shoulders? How was I going to cock my baseball hat? Was I going to wear it straight on, cock it to the left, cock it to the right? How was I going to wear my pants? Was I going to wear them really baggy or not? What shoes was I going to wear? Who was I going to walk with to school? How many of them were going to be with me? It had to be all boys. It always had to be all boys. It could never be girls. Where were those boys from? Which route were we going to take to school? Were we going to take the long route down Tioga Parkway, across Gwen Oak, and up Dukeland Hill? Were we going to cut through the woods? Were we going to go up Liberty Heights? And then once I got to school, after I was in class, in what class was supposed to be, there was an entire ritual that I had to go through at lunchtime. Was I actually, going to go to lunch that day? Was I going to try to, cut lunch and wander the hallways? Was I going to go to the library instead of going to lunch? And then after school, how was I going to go home? Was I going to go home right away? Was I going to stay for coach class, which was not actually coach class? There were other reasons that I'm getting to for why I would stay for coach class. And when I left, again, who was I walking with? How many of them was it? Which direction was I taking? Was I going to take the very, very long route all the way up towards Ricestown and then catch the subway back home? Was I going to go to my grandmother's house that day? Every single one of those decisions was totally committed to the mission of keeping violence from being done to my body. That was the entirety of what all of those rituals were about. I say this all the time. As a student in Baltimore City Public School, particularly right around middle school and going into high school, I would say each day 1/3 of my brain was dedicated to negotiating violence. And I knew this, and I felt like some degree of injustice about this, even though I couldn't quite articulate why that was. And I knew that, like, when I talked to, my cousins, for instance, who lived in Philadelphia, when I talked to my father's friends who lived in Chicago, who were roughly my age or about my age, they lived under the same sort of situation. They went through the same sort of rituals every day. I knew that my brother, my older brother, for instance, went through the same sort of rituals every day. I knew that my older brother, in fact, as I've talked about before, had a handgun that he had hidden in his bomber jacket in our closet. And at night I would come home and I would, think about all this, And I knew that, like, the connection between obviously me and my brother and my cousins and all those, young folks I knew in Chicago was that all of us were black. And that for some reason we had very, very similar rituals, even though we were in, different cities. And I suspect if you go to New Orleans about that time, and maybe even today, you would find a similar sort of ritual that young African-American males and females also go through to shield themselves against violence. Well, I would come home, and I would cut on the TV at night, and I would look at the shows beamed into my house. I would watch Family Ties or The Wonder Years or, whatever was popular at that time, Leave It to Beaver in syndication or whatever. And I was struck by the gulf between the world in which I lived and the world that America projected out to the rest of the world. And so I knew, as an African American, as a member of a minority population, that these sort of rituals that we went through, I think what the mayor would call a culture of violence, but I would call a culture of self-preservation. I knew that this was particular to me, that this was not the case for the rest of the world. I don't so much disagree, with the mayor in terms of if you live certain places, you develop certain practices. I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's patently true. It's certainly true of my experience. I think what we often miss when we talk about culture is it becomes an easy way to not acknowledge the fact that people are actually making rational decisions within the life, within the structures, within the places that they live. And I think, like, that's very, very hard for us to get and to, say to me, for instance, when I was a kid, well, you probably shouldn't think as much about how you're dressed. You should think more about school. Was to effectively speak Spanish to me. I would not have been able to understand or translate what you were saying because I was concerned with the preservation of my body. If I can't secure my safety, then everything else you're saying to me has no sort of meaning at all.
How was that culture created? The culture in which you had to spend a third of your brain space?
Well, that was the great question I had, and it's the very reason why I'm a writer. And I think, it's quite clear how that culture is created. African-American life in this country has been violent from the moment we got here in 1619. There's always been a culture of violence that was put upon us. I'm sorry to take you guys through the long history lesson, but we have 250 years of slavery. We have 150 years of Jim Crow, which is violence. And during that period, we have redlining to make sure we herd certain people into certain neighborhoods. We deprive those neighborhoods of resources. We deprive those neighborhoods of jobs. We create what people call, what sociologists call, criminogenic conditions. And then we're shocked that the murder rate is higher there. Why are you shocked? Who's shocked by this? Why wouldn't the murder rate be high? I mean, that stat you gave at the beginning was certainly horrifying. But it's also to be expected if you render an honest, reading of American history. It horrifies me, but it doesn't necessarily, shock me. And I just want to, close this out by getting back to your question about black-on-black crime. I object to that phrase not because I object to the numbers, or I think the numbers are cooked up, or anything like that. People tend to kill who they live around, period. That's just true if you study violence, that's just true of anything. I don't know, you're talking about the most segregated population in America through the vast majority of the 20th century and into the 21st century. I don't know who else would do the killing. But when we use the term black-on-black crime, we ignore the fact that black people live in this condition in the first place did not happen by accident. It's a result of policy decisions that we actually made.
You want me to respond on that?
I want you to respond to it.
We actually have no disagreements. We're stuck on language. So my question is, do you want me to stop caring about black kids who are getting slaughtered on my streets?
Of course not.
Oh, good. Okay.
Of course not.
So if we can agree on that, then we can get past the issue of language, because when I'm speaking about the culture of violence, and you're talking about the general culture of how you get to school and how you don't get back to school and how you need to be safe. And by the way, for the white people in this room that don't live in an African-American neighborhood, that is daily life. The same way when you're getting out of your car and you're in a dangerous situation and you got your bags and you hope somebody doesn't hit you on the head going into your school, every African-American kid in all of my neighborhoods in the city of New Orleans feel that way every day. So he's completely right about that. What I'm saying is this, is that, and so then you got to get to the next question, which is, why is the culture that way? There is clearly a pattern of behavior that has developed amongst young African American men since 1980 in this country. And I want to just put it there because that's where the statistics show, that mirror the same kind of behavior that Italians had in the 30s when the mafia was doing their thing, and the same thing in the Wild West, where the practice has been, because the culture forced it to become this way, that the way we solve our problem is that we shoot each other in the head and kill each other rather than have a fight. That pattern of behavior has actually happened. And I think what he's saying is, and I want you guys to be aware of this, that African American men between 16 and 35 are an endangered species in certain neighborhoods in the United States of America. So I don't want to quarrel with you about the language. I'll accept whatever language you want me to use. What I want to do is keep the country focused on the fact that 7,000 African American men were killed on the streets of America last year. And while it is true that white people kill and black people kill, if you focus on who the killer is, if you focus on the victim, African Americans are about 10% of our population, but are 40 to 50% of the victims. And so if someone was saying, just like when Hillary Clinton spoke the other day, she was talking about disparities in education outcomes, et cetera, and I don't know why the nation's hair is not on fire about this, the victims of violent crime are disproportionately African American men, and I want to try to find a way to solve that problem, which then gets you into the hard questions about, well, how did this culture actually get developed? Because guess what, when you ask that question, everybody in this room has to get involved in that conversation. Then it takes you to the institutions, it takes you to the community, it takes you to a bunch. I'm simply saying to the country, that is an unacceptable state of affairs for that many American citizens to be killed the way they're killed on the streets of America, and we should address that problem however we can.
Question, Jeff? Can I just want to answer? So I just want to get to this point about 1980s. It's very interesting when I talk to my dad, and he talks about, he grew up in Philadelphia, actually much worse circumstance than I grew up in. And when he talks about navigating the streets, he talks about it in much the same way I do. You don't think it has something to do with the greater prevalence of handguns?
Yeah, no, it has to do with a whole bunch of stuff. I'm just saying, just if you look at the numbers, the kinds of murders and the way they happened, who killed and who was shot, something changed around 1980 that for the last 30 years put us someplace where another group of the community was in the 1930s and another group of the community was back in the 1850s. And that cultural pattern of behavior, the important question is, why did that happen? Why did it develop? What was it related to? And can we go back and find the root cause and decide to change it? If really, and this is going to be a little bit tough, if Black Lives Matter. So in my view, Baltimore, Ferguson was about whether the criminal justice system treated African Americans equally and consequently as valuable as white lives. But I'm talking about the existence. Nobody's really talking about the deaths of young African American men on the streets of America that live in neighborhoods that nobody ever goes to, including middle-class African Americans and middle-class whites.
Let me ask you this, because we've talked about this, and I've watched you in action on this, and you get pissed off at middle-class African-American communities, and you get pissed off at whites for valuing Black lives differently. And this is, I don't want to put words in, I don't want to put your argument back in your mouth, but you have asked the question publicly in your city, why aren't there demonstrations and mass rallies of Black Lives Matter when it is young African-Americans killing young African-Americans as opposing the police? So talk about that feeling, and I want Ta-Nehisi to respond.
Forgive me if I'm using the wrong language, and you can cure my language. But I don't find anybody marching on City Hall when a young man gets his brains blown out. Since the shootings in South Carolina, which the whole nation stopped on, as we should, and this is a moment in the country that we should seize and move to a better place. 40 Americans, every one of those days was killed on the streets of America, and half of them are young African-American men whose heads were blown off in my city, and not one person has raised about it, because maybe we feel we can't touch that. Maybe that's not us. And for middle-class African-Americans, who, by the way, can be just like middle-class whites, who are busy raising their kids, sending their kids to college, they're saying, well, why are you asking me just because I'm African-American? Those are not my kids either. So maybe it's about poverty. Maybe it's about alienation. I'm saying to you that we have American citizens who are getting killed every day. And guess what? If white people are getting killed this way, we should care about that too, because lives do matter. And when you have that kind of violence, that only rears its head when it happens, let's say, on Bourbon Street. Now, if a black kid gets killed on Bourbon Street, when everybody's down there for the Essence Festival, there for the Jazz Festival, and CNN and everybody comes, somebody got killed in the city, then all of a sudden you start thinking my city's unsafe. When 5 or 6 kids could have gotten killed 2 or 3 days before and nobody raises the issue. And that does aggravate me. It frustrates me to death because I'm the one that helps peel them off the street. I go to the funerals. I talk to the mothers. The searing pain in the community over these deaths is just almost mind-boggling and hard to take. And I can just tell you as a mayor, my city will never be able to stand up and be as full and as beautiful and as wonderful as it should be if every one of our citizens are not safe.
Ta-Nehisi, let me follow this by noting something that you've obviously noticed, which is that there's a dominant narrative on the right in this country that African-American leadership in this country is hypocritical on the issue of violence, because when one black kid gets shot by a cop, it provokes nationwide outrage, but you have thousands of kids dying across the country each year. You've heard this narrative, obviously. Right. I want you to respond to that narrative.
Well, first of all, I don't agree with that narrative. I think that's wrong, and I think that narrative is a cop-out. It doesn't mean that what I said is essentially not true.
Well, well, first of all, I got to applaud the mayor's passion, which I think is real and genuine. I want to say that before I respond, because I don't want people to think that, I don't want you to think, I doubt that you actually care, or that, it's just like false motives or anything like that. That said, I have to say, I can't speak for New Orleans, although I think I bet I could speak for New Orleans, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to. The notion that black people do not march and do not protest against violence in their own community is just patently false. It's utter and completely, I mean, I don't want to, send people to my blog on The Atlantic, but I've responded to this charge before. I mean, African Americans around the country constantly hold Stop the Violence marches. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Baltimore, where I'm from, in DC. I know this because when I was growing up in the community, it's all we saw. That was the constant thing. It was a great, as you know, Jeff, great hip-hop record called Self-Destruction. It was literally called Self-Destruction. It was not focused on police violence. It was focused on what you guys would call black-on-black crime. I know this because, I live in Harlem right now. And at least, every couple, months or so, there's some sort of march coming down Lenox Avenue that's protesting. I mean, literally, like I was walking down the street with my wife just like 2 weeks ago. We got a flyer on this, Stop the Violence. They weren't, marching about something down in South Carolina.
Do you have a very different experience, or are you not seeing something in New Orleans?
No, I want to respond. We're just a couple of degrees off. I would say this. When the conservative group of folks who don't want to talk about the fact that the criminal justice system is unequal, or don't want to talk about police doing the wrong things at the wrong time, in order to avoid talking about it, they say, don't talk to me until you fix your own stuff. Then come back and see me, as though it doesn't exist. Well, first of all, that's wrong. We ought to be addressing the issue of the disparate treatment of the criminal justice system for African Americans. In my state, we have more people in jail than anywhere else in America. I took you there. We went to Angola. There's 7,000 African American men that are in a prison right now, a maximum security prison. The distension that causes, the alienation is huge. So yes, criminal justice reform is important and necessary. Yes, police departments have to learn how to protect and serve. They have to learn how to see people based on their behavior, not the color of their skin. By the way, just like we have to learn how to see the police by their actions and not necessarily by the uniform. We have a huge amount of work. And yes, we can do all of these at the same time. But it is also true that we have a huge number of African Americans who are victims of violent crime, and we need to find a way to stop that because their lives matter. Now, it's also true, he said, that people march all the time. And the African American community and the white community, people get upset about crime and they show up at the mayor's doorstep and they say, you got to fix it, like I'm the only one. I created it and I'm the only one that can solve it, but that's okay. But I would just say, as a general rule, the kind of pressure that I feel does not come to the fore. There are certain groups of people that meet, African Americans and whites, that always are working on violence issue, but not the intensity and the level of prolonged, we're not taking this anymore. And this is true about, I'm not blaming this on just the black community, this is true about white folks too, who come to me and say, you got to do something about that crime. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do about it? And when are you going to show up?
Well, I think, and I'll just speak to, for instance, like police violence. I'll just say that there's a certain sort of feeling that you get when just a random criminal in your neighborhood perpetrates a crime. And then there's a very, very different feeling when someone who you pay taxes to protect you perpetrates a crime. You definitely are going to feel differently about one than the other. And so if you're seeing, a greater, intensity, if you're seeing people coming directly to your door, I think that's because, when you talk about, intra-community violence, among people who live next door to us, it's often focused on the community. It's often about what the community needs to do.
Wait, let me be clear, but I am not at all, I have no problem with the marches around the country and the intensity of the marches around Ferguson and Baltimore. I think they're well placed. When they're done, in a safe way that helps you unify. I think they're great things. I'm not against that. I'm actually for it, and I think it's all great. All I'm saying is, and I'm speaking on behalf of young African-American men that cannot speak for themselves, and you know what? I can speak for them because I'm their mayor. They need champions. They need people to care about them, and we have got to find a way to figure out how the culture was developed, whoever had anything to do with it, and we have to change that walk that you took to school. That's what I'm trying to do in my city. How do we change that walk? Because it is crazy for all of our young boys and girls to be walking back and forth to school, and all they're thinking about is not how do I do on my math exam, not whether I'm going to make the football team, but am I going to make it home alive? Now, I want y'all to think about that. I want y'all to think about the freedom that you have in your lives, not to be thinking about that kind of stuff during the day. And I don't want my kids in my city having to feel that way. And there is a lot that goes into thinking about how we change our patterns of behavior with each other and our institutions to make that a safe place for them. That's all I'm trying to talk about.
Two final things before we go to questions from the audience. The first is, assuming that you believe that this culture exists, how does society break that culture so that young African-American males walking to school can think about the things that you just talked about?
The society breaks the culture of self-preservation, as I call it, in the African-American community.
And how is that?
By the destruction of white supremacy in this country. It's just that simple. We have very, very old vestiges and practices that continue into this day. Right now, the biggest social service resource investment we have in the African-American community is our prisons. Right now, we were lucky that the Fair Housing Act actually got upheld. But right now, we have very, very limited controls, in terms of documenting how people are discriminated against, in terms of where they can live. We have almost no sort of real survey data outside of academia in terms of job discrimination and things like that. We have to start taking the structural forces that got us here seriously. And I have to say this. I'm sorry, Jeff. I don't mean to take too much time. But I think there's a problem here where we're talking about the violence of the police and the violence that happens in the community as though they're two sort of mutually opposed things. What I'm trying to say is they actually are the same thing. They actually are the product of the same thing. The reason why the violence happens in the community, the reason why I had to take that long walk the way I did when I was a child was because, and this is just the history of Baltimore, this is just a straight fact, somebody made a decision. The people of Baltimore made a decision, the federal government made a decision that certain people were going to live in certain communities and they were going to have more investment than other people. That's a policy decision. Just like it was a policy decision that we made that Freddie Gray, when he makes eye contact with a police officer and decides to run it, he can be arrested for that. That's a policy decision. But let me ask They're actually part of the same thing.
Let me ask you this, and then I want the mayor to respond, and then we'll go to questions. But so you're sitting with a mayor of a city who's term limited. You got 3 more years in your term. As effective as he is, thank goodness it's a lot, or thank goodness it's a little?
Thank goodness it's almost over.
Oh, all right. As effective as he is, as well-meaning as he is, he's not changing structural racism in the United States of America.
Right.
And so what would you say to him in the next 3 years, what can you do within the confines of your city to actually make life better for African-American males? I mean, it's a practical question. Then I want you to answer that question yourself. But the practical question is, he's not gonna end white supremacy.
Right. He can be a part of it, though.
Well, he is a part of it, I think. But go to that.
Well, the first thing I would say is I've never been to New Orleans. So I want to, stay in my
city,
place,
actually,
right? So I'm not going to, necessarily give him political advice. The one thing I will say though, and I hate saying this, but it took us, centuries to get where we're at right now. It's going to take a long time to dig ourselves out. You're right. He can't do it. Mitch Landrieu can't do it in 3 years. It probably will be a succession of mayors. I am highly skeptical You know, and I hate saying this, I don't mean any disrespect. You know, but I'm highly skeptical that within, you know, 1 or 2 mayoral terms, I don't know how long they give you guys down there, you know, you can totally, you know, ameliorate a problem that really goes back, I mean, literally centuries. You know, you can be a part of it, you can take one step forward, you can move us in the right direction, but I mean, we're talking about policies that at the local level, state level, federal level. I'm doubtful.
Tell me if I'm wrong about this. You're a very frustrated man because sometimes, but because you have a problem that seems unfixable within the time frame that you have. Is that a fair?
I don't know. Well, no. First of all, I'm very hopeful about it. I do think it's fixable. I do think he's right that it's taken us a long time.
You think it's fixable in your 3 years?
No. Okay. But I'm just kind of the custodian of the thing right now. If you can't fix it, if someone doesn't call it and claim it and start it, you got to start somewhere. Somebody's got to address the problem. And by the way, this is all, you see, I think sometimes people get really defensive and you say black on black crime, oh, you're blaming us for the crime. I'm talking about the victims, right? Because everybody gets into whose fault it is right away and why are you blaming me and what's my role in it. I tell people this about race and history. And by the way, I'm a kid from the South and I really feel like I have just as much a right to talk about racism and our history as anybody else does. And I think it's important that we all own this in a special way because we didn't all come to it in the same way. But I would say this so that we don't get into the history of whose fault it was. That issue may never get resolved, but I can tell you whose responsibility it is to fix it. It's all of our responsibilities to fix it, part A. Part B, you have to start someplace. I have started a conversation. This is part of starting that conversation, and I do think it involves all of us. I agree with him that the institutions and how we deal with things that have to change, from discrimination to jobs, to redlining neighborhoods, but there's also a lot of personal responsibility in this as well. You know, somebody has used the phrase that if I knocked you off the chair, you know, last week, that's on you, but if we come back and you're still on the floor next week, you know, that's on you. I mean, that's on me, then that's on you. Or if someone broke your arm, you can yell and scream that they broke your arm. They're probably not going to be the person that's going to fix it. That doesn't mean we can't figure out other ways to get it fixed. And what we have to do in this country is think about all of the things that are necessary to produce an environment of peace. That requires personal responsibility. It requires involvement from the faith-based community. It requires finding a way to build strong families, however you define that. And it involves the things that we've talked about today, is reorganizing our institutions that are not discriminatory, that are fair, that are open, that give people the opportunities to realize their dreams. And we have not had that in the country. That's why this discussion is important. So you asked me why I did this. The reason is because if you can fix this problem, I think this is the hardest of the hard, by the way. I'm not minimizing all of the other difficult problems we're having with the community and the police. We can fix it. But if you can fix this particular problem, it takes you into all of the other difficult areas because we can't fix this until we fix those. And I just think it's worth talking about.
Ta-Nehisi, I'm reading a level of dissatisfaction on your face about something that the mayor said. Your face is pretty easily readable.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's one of his many charms. The personal responsibility as a trope.
No, I think what he said about what the mayor said about knocking somebody out. It is my fault if I knocked you off the chair.
I didn't say it wasn't.
I mean, but no, it's never not my fault that I knocked you off the chair. You know what I mean?
It doesn't cease to be.
Here's the whole issue. This is. Let me just get it. This is.
Everybody, as a horrible person, it never ceases to be my fault.
That's exactly right, which is why the other day I officially apologized for slavery on behalf of the city of New Orleans. There has to be a recognition. If there's going to be a reconciliation, there has to be a recognition and an admission that somebody did something wrong and an apology for it. And then you got to get to the next thing. If we stay into, well, I'm gonna engage in, it was not my fault, it was your fault, and you stay on the ground, when you can stand back up or you can stand back up with help. All I'm saying is that all of us have to get all of us out. If the African-American community waits around for folks in the white community who don't know anybody to fix the problem, that's not how it's going to get fixed. White people of goodwill, other individuals of goodwill, African-Americans of goodwill are going to have to come together and find a pathway forward which doesn't involve, it was your fault, no, I'm going to sit around and wait. It has to be all of us can figure it out, and it kind of stinks because, yeah, you can say, well, I never put myself in this position. That's true. But personal responsibility is always a part of it. It's a small part of it, but it's an important part of it. But guess what? So is investments in institutions that give everybody an opportunity, which means great investments in public education, great investments in infrastructure, investments in housing, the things we need, because then he's right that how else would you expect anything but what you got which is the violence. So we all had responsibility in producing the culture that exists, but we all have responsibility of getting out of it. And I just think that that's, you know, I don't want to say it's not debatable, but I just think that that's the obvious way to move, but we have to be willing to do it.
I want to go to as many questions as we can. I want these questions with a question mark at the end, please. There's somebody right there to start, and then we'll come over here.
Hello, Mayor Landrieu. My name is Mary Pat Hector. I've actually met you several times. I've been part of the Cities United initiative that you started with Mayor Nunner. But my question is, you say that when, you know, if you fall off the chair, it's your fault. But as, well, something similar to that. But when you say that question and you say people need to take responsibility and do something, when I look at the news and see a lot of different African-American young people doing something regarding gun violence and black-on-black crime or police brutality, they're labeled as thugs or they're not doing it the right way and they don't know what they're doing. And as a 17-year-old girl who faces this and has an 8-year-old brother, and you know, if black people pick themselves up from their bootstraps and become successful, then they forget about their communities and they forget where they come from. And so I'm asking you, what do you think the solution is? What can we do? Because if we do something right, or that we feel like we're making progression and doing something to solve these issues, we're wrong, or we're not doing it the right way, or we are talking about race and we're trying to fix the problem, but we are destroying our own communities. So what do you think the proper solution is?
Because we got a lot of questions. Let me have them answer.
I want to be really clear about this. First of all, I think everything you're doing is great, and I appreciate it. And I think that when you march and you do those things, that's wonderful. That's a great thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. But when I'm talking about personal responsibility, I'm talking about the young man himself who's about to shoot or get shot. In that moment, that individual has to think for a second. I'm not talking about, I never said, you never ever will ever hear me say the African-American community's got to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. That's a complete punt and a fake and completely wrong. We in America have an obligation to stand up all American citizens and not just say, that's on you. That's completely wrong. But I've never said that. And it's just interesting because I'm finding that when I say things and what people hear are really completely different things, and they hear it from the position that they're in, which is why
the whole thing about somebody.
Yeah, what I'm saying is this.
I just want to get clear.
If this is a chair.
Yeah, the chair.
If you're sitting on a chair and I knock you off of the chair, that's my fault and that's on me. Now, normally, what's that person going to do? They're going to walk away and they're going to leave. If all you do is sit on the floor and you do nothing and you stay there, waiting for the person to come back and pick you up, and nothing changes, the laws of nature are that you're going to wind up staying there. You got to do something to get up. That doesn't mean that I still don't have the obligation to come back and help you. But guess what? If I choose not to come back, or I don't want to come back, or I've decided to run off, then that's on you. It's only a statement that everybody's got.
You're saying it's a cruel world, and nobody's going to help you at a certain point.
If the folks don't come back and help you, who for some reason didn't like you because they pushed you off the chair first, and all you do is sit there and wait for them to decide that they're going to have a transformation, there is something you can do to help yourself. It doesn't obviate the fact that the person made a mistake or that they were wrong or that they owe you. The question is now, well, how do you get up and keep moving? And guess what? There are other folks that will come back and help. That gets you into the institutional issue. That's the only point. It's not an either or. For us, it's a both and.
I had a mic out there. Was that you? Yeah, you have the mic.
Hi, Ta-Nehisi. I think you're the greatest. I follow you. In addition to structural changes, which take time, on a micro level, I think Jeff asked this, but I didn't really hear anything specific. On a micro level, child to child, what do you recommend to do? What about the icons in the Black American community? Where are they? Do they have a role? Oprah, Jay-Z, whoever the kids relate to, can they do more in a very overt way?
I think on a micro level, I think black folks are doing about as much as any human being would be doing in the position that we're in right now. I think black folks are doing just fine. You know, it is never as fine. I just disagree with this. I disagree with the notion, with the idea that black people, or any significant population of black people, are sitting on the floor, having been knocked off a chair and just waiting around. I don't think that's actually what's happening. You know, I think black people are struggling mightily, you know, in a situation that was put upon them. The people who have lapsed, I hate repeating this to you guys. I hate saying, I don't want to have this conversation with folks, but these are the facts. The people who have lapsed in terms of their debt to African Americans as citizens is us as a society and as a government. I mean, that's just a fact. There's never been there's no history of a lack of responsibility among black folks. Listen, we live in a country where the greatest, I don't know what, I guess you would say, patron saint in our country is a man who got shot in the head for standing up for this idea of being nonviolent and being hopeful in terms of our relationship towards white people. I just saw 2 weeks ago a community of black people where a gentleman came into the church, pretended to be there, to worship and to want to be a part of the community. They welcomed him in, and he shot them down in cold blood. And when he did this, he was well within a tradition and within a lineage of doing such things to black people. And to see those folks within days go into a courtroom and say, "We forgive you. We forgive you." Now, I see the Confederate flag came down. I'm happy about that. But what I'm saying is there's no lack of effort on behalf of black people. That's effort right there. You know what I mean? To cease to, after that, to respond in that way, that's effort. There's no lack of effort on our part.
Let me give Mitch time to respond, and then I got one more question.
Please, I did not say, nor did I try to intimate that the black community is sitting on the ground doing nothing. That is not what I said, and that's not what I intimated. I wouldn't be working on this if I thought that is what the issue was. There are lots of people, black and white, that are working on this issue. I simply say to you the fact that there are hundreds of young African Americans being killed on the streets of the city of New Orleans and across America. And that the same amount of attention that we're all paying to the tremendous devastation in South Carolina, to the tremendous amount of disconnect between the police is not being visited on that, and we have to find a way to think about it. I'm simply saying, just as a matter of course, on a personal level, that if we keep waiting on people who don't think like us, or don't look like us, or don't like us to show up and help, and that's all we're waiting on, it's all a part of us coming together. I don't think that the country is as keyed into the issue of the number of African American victims. I think that's a worthy thing to be thinking about. The message that I'm getting is, hey man, leave that alone. Go worry about all the other things running the city, and because it's just an interesting thing, and we can't get to how are we going to save these young men. I think that's a worthy and noble thing to be thinking about, don't you? So let's find a way to do that, rather than saying to people, well, you don't understand, and having all, let's figure out as a country that we want to save the lives of young African American men and figure out how to do it and how to talk in a way that gets us into a positive place so that we can find specific things that all of us can do on the ground on a personal level, not necessarily on the black community or the white community, but all of us together.
You want to go over there?
My name is Tina Walls. My sister is one of the Little Rock Nine, and that's important only because it's about taking action.
Correct.
Action has always been taken by our community. I participate in a women's group, an African American women's group that has adopted a school in the Denver Public Schools that's primarily African American, free and reduced lunch. We are working in our community. But my question is this. In the 10 years post-Katrina, what kind of systemic change has occurred in the public school system and in the ability of those without access in the past to get jobs?
Combination of a lot of things. First of all, you know that after Katrina, 500,000 homes were hurt, 250,000 were destroyed. The city was just basically on its back. We have been in the midst right now of rebuilding housing in every neighborhood in the city of New Orleans. Some neighborhoods are coming back slower than others. Poor neighborhoods are coming back slower, and you see that. But those are being reconstructed. The entire school system, we're building $1.8 billion of new construction to give our kids in the city, most of whom are African American, 21st century, knowledge-based, physically good schools and good teachers. And in the healthcare delivery system, we've moved from having a centralized bureaucracy where mamas had to go sit for 13 hours in the emergency room to get the baby's ears checked to 88 primary healthcare clinics. And then finally, what I call pathway to prosperity, where 52% of African American men in the city of New Orleans are not working. That is not a sustainable model. It's not moral. It's not just. It doesn't make any sense. And so we're working with anchor institutions to make sure that when they have job openings, they connect to people in the neighborhood and then create job trainings to do those things. So those institutional changes that we talked about, we are doing in the city of New Orleans. I'll just say this, I can only be the mayor for 8 years. This has been a historical problem that's gone on for hundreds of years in our country, and we have to take this pivot, this moment, and pivot to the future and recognize that there are institutional barriers to African Americans moving into a place where that culture that we talked about is not developed. And by the way, when I talk about people not showing up at City Hall, I'm not just talking about African Americans, I'm talking about whites. When there's a carjacking in the white community, man, all hell breaks loose. I promise you, lots of people show up, but when it's the murder of a young African American man, nobody's talking. So it's the same thing. And this is not an indictment of one race versus the other. I'm just talking about as a people, people are not getting as excitable as the murder of a young African American man, especially if the kid that killed him had some difficulty with the law too. And I'm just trying to call attention to their lives' value just as, or as much value as anybody else's in the United States of America.
Talking about this as black on black, a way of white people segregating the problem in a kind of way, saying it's over there,
well,
it doesn't.
I think it's obvious that we hear things from the perspective that we're in, and they're triggers to the words that we use. So we all have to get better at it. You don't want the result to be, let's not talk about it, or let's not deal with it, or you go fix your stuff first and then come back and see me later. Those are not constructive ways to get to, okay, what are we going to do now? Yes, we recognize it's a problem. Yes, it's important to us. And what do we all have to do to fix it? That's a better conversation to have rather than, I don't like the words you use and blah, blah, blah. Let's figure out what the right words are if it's important. If this is not important, we can pass it by and you think the country's going to be okay. I just happen not to agree with that. I think this is a seminal problem that we have to deal with.
Ta-Nehisi, would you be more comfortable talking about this as a black on black question if we talked about the Waco motorcycle gang shootout as white on white crime? I mean, or is it just, does putting this in group setting just obscure the essence and the nature of the problem?
Well, first of all, I'm not uncomfortable talking about it. I mean, not to big up myself, but I wrote an entire book about growing up in Baltimore and my relationship with my dad and violence, which you all can buy. So I've spent most of, a great deal of my career talking. So
but I mean the expression and sort of
no, I think the expression is in fact inaccurate. I don't think it's insensitive. I don't think it's a mere, problem of phraseology. I think it's actually inaccurate. Most violence happens among people who live among each other. Again, if you have a group of people who, due to policy, are in a criminogenic situation, it's highly likely that the people that they are going to kill are people who are going to live next door to them. It's not. So black on black crime is sort of positioned as a, just let me get through this. Black on black crime is positioned against this notion that at some point in time, the majority of violence done against black people was done by the Klan, but that actually was never true. It's always been true that the majority of violence that black people did to each other was around your neighbor. That's just that.
If there's one thing that you could do policy-wise, to actually break this cycle, would it be massive housing desegregation? Would it be what would it be? Make believe you're a mayor for a day.
Well, I don't know what I would do if I was a mayor. I can tell you what I would do if I was king. I mean, I don't know what I would do if I was a mayor.
Well, first
I actually think it's beyond mayors.
First you get mayor, and then you go king.
Well, I think it's actually beyond mayors. I really believe that. I can tell you what I'd do as king, though, easily.
He really wants to tell us what he'd do. Let him tell us what you'll do as king, and then let King Landrieu finish the
Yeah, King Ta-Nehisi. I'll tell you what King Ta-Nehisi would do. We have a situation right now where I believe the incarceration ratio of black to white is something like for every 8 to 10, it's like one white person incarcerated. We have the largest, you guys already know this, we have the highest incarceration rate and just raw number in the country. China has about 1 billion more people. We have about 800,000 more actually incarcerated people. The incarceration rate for America is 750 per 100,000 or something like that. For black males, it's like 4,000. It's ridiculous. This is unprecedented. It's a public policy disaster. I would immediately begin finding ways to get people out of prison. And by the way, I include violent criminals in that. I don't just mean the marijuana.
What do you mean violent?
Well, the idea that, like with a gun crime. I don't just mean the marijuana, dealer who got, 3 strikes. I mean gun crimes
But an actual gun crime. Somebody who actually committed a gun crime.
Yes.
And you want to return them into the community.
Yes, I do. I do. And I don't want to just, let them out with no sort of support, with no sort of, policy around, how can we get them employable.
I'm going to hurt you here. You sound like
a congressman.
No, you sound like a congressman.
Not a
You
king?
haven't heard me at all.
Sounds
You
like a
sound like a congressman. Here's my problem. That's really nice advice. And you know, criminal justice reform is really important, and we should do it. But this is how criminal justice reform works. You come forward with an idea. The folks on the other side say, I like it or I don't. You go to the state legislature, you go to Congress, you talk about it for 2 or 3 years, and then eventually you either get it done or you don't get it done. And then in the meantime, 40 people a day are killed on the streets of America. Here's my problem. I don't talk in platitudes. I don't talk in philosophy. I don't talk about the black community or the white community. I talk about Joe or Jamal that's going to get their head blown out tomorrow. My life is immediate. So I guess what I want to know is
my life is immediate.
No, but what I'm saying is, as a mayor, in terms of talking about,
I'm an African-American male living in an African-American community with a 14-year-old son.
I got that.
It's as immediate for me,
what
too.
I'm saying to you is this, while we're changing all the institutional frameworks that we have to change, what I need to figure out is tomorrow in New Orleans, how I stop that young man from getting killed. So as everybody's talking theoretically, philosophically, institutionally, and how we move our country to where both you and I agree that it needs to go. We're on the exact same page. We may have a difference of opinion about how to get there. What I'm saying to you is there is immediate catastrophic epidemic that needs to be erased. And so this gets to the issue of, well, okay, if the cavalry is not coming to save us, and I put us in the same category, what are we going to do in the community tomorrow, as fathers, as sons, as coaches, to change the way that we reconcile the differences that we have? That is really about, you can call it personal, whatever. Well, that's not true, because you need to come to my city, because let me tell you what we're doing. We have something called NOLA for Life. NOLA for Life is a 5-part program. The first thing we're doing is making sure that every kid in New Orleans is part of our recreation program during the summer. We're making sure that they get fed. We're making sure that their enrichment programs when it's over. We're making sure that they have a job. We're making sure that we are now reconnecting the police to them. We are actually working. I'm not waiting for everybody else to change the world. As a matter of my personal responsibility, I'm connecting these young men. The other day, I opened up a $20 million recreation center called Sanchez Center. We're bringing the kids in from the neighborhood, and they're swimming, and they're learning music, and they're playing basketball. That is about how, as my personal responsibility, I'm grabbing these individual kids and teaching them reconciliation. We're doing something called the Welcome Table, where we're bringing whites and blacks together and actually sitting at a table talking through race in the city of New Orleans, which we've been doing for 2 years. I'm not waiting on Congress to change Paul Ryan and whoever's talking about all of that stuff. That's what I mean. When I say personal responsibility, I'm not waiting on somebody else to do it. We're doing it ourselves. Every one of those things moves the dial and will save a life.
Let me just say 2 quick things. The first is that I think you can see over the past hour why my colleague and friend Ta-Nehisi has, with his arguments and ideas, challenged and made millions of people uncomfortable and gotten millions of people in America thinking about these issues. And I think, let me also say that there is, to the best of my knowledge, exactly one white politician in the South who is grappling in a serious way with these issues, and he's sitting next to me. And so I want to thank both of them very much for coming, and thank you very much for coming today.